Hey everybody, we have Ryan Giordano on the podcast today. Ryan, thanks so much for joining us. So a little background on Ryan. Ryan is an organizational developer at Blend, which also includes learning and development at the organization. For those of you who don't know Blend has raised over $290 million in venture financing. They're one of the hottest companies in the consumer finance space. And they've been backed by VC funds like Founders Fund, Greylock, General Atlantic, and many others. So Ryan, thanks for being on the podcast today.
Oh yeah, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Cool. Well, let's get started at the top. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you made your way into the world of organizational effectiveness and L&D.
Yeah. So I guess for starters, usually people start with their educational background. So I went to Chico State and graduated with a degree in organizational communications. And what that meant is that by the time graduation came around and I started to think about where I wanted to go for work, while most of my peers were reasonably and understandably looking for a good salary or a reputable company, the number one thing to me was looking for a culture that would welcome me as I saw myself at the time. And I think ever since I've always just been focused on what can a company do to make people feel most at home, because ultimately that's what's best for the company. That's how people are most effective. So the way I got my start is really from my major onward. I graduated from college looking for jobs that would take org effectiveness or whatever that concept would have been called at the time, take that seriously. And so Pandora was actually one of the first companies I really saw. I set my sights on them when I was still in college, and everything I was focused on was what type of culture that they held there. Were people allowed to kind of come and go on their own time? Did people get to speak up when they saw problems? Did you get to really be yourself? If if there was something kind of geeky about you, could you bring that to work and not feel awkward about it? So I'd say that's where I got my start, because from my first job onward, I've always felt that companies could do more. I think we'll talk about this today, but I've spent a bunch of time in training because that's one of the most obvious places where companies can make improvements.
Awesome. And I'm so thankful because I use Pandora every day on my Alexa device. So that's what soothes me at home. But let's dive into Pandora, such a great company, one of the music stalwarts of the world. So walk us through your time there. You started a training enablement role there. Tell us a little about some of the great programs you built, learning experiences you had there, and kind of the kind of imprint you made on that company.
Yeah. Well, I know a part of the nature of this conversation is to help inspire other folks in this space. And so I'll just start off the bat by saying, I did whatever I could to get into that company, because often you don't get to jump right into an L&D role. Even if that's what you want, you have to work your way there sometimes, and that's just how it goes. So I spent my first 3 months there in not on training, but actually in the advertising department. But I guess my advice for people is that what happened is I was there only 3 months when I caught wind that they were starting up a training team. And the reason that I was told about that is because I was already, just in my first 3 months, I had started to figure out, as I was onboarding, how could they improve it for the very next person? And I think that's a very important thing to do, is to try to leave a better path behind you than the one set out in front of you, no matter what role or function you're in. And so by doing that type of work and making recommendations on training, I was able to get the attention of the people who were starting this training team. And even though I was so new to the company, I took a leap and applied for the job, and ultimately went up against a bunch of other people internally who had been there longer, but still got it. And I think while at the time I was just some crazy kid going for whatever I could, I think it goes to show, like, if you don't try, you'll never know. From there, I was one of the first hires on this training team, and our job was to figure out, hey, we've got this, blossoming advertising business. We have a department of about 300 or 400 people in client services, and split across 3 to 4 different roles. And one of the first things we needed to do was build a scalable onboarding program for all those roles. And so we built a blended training program called the Academy. And that was a very much a group effort. We had several people involved, but it involved coming to Oakland for on-site training and learning how to use our systems and tools, but also a whole suite of e-learning tools. And that was really successful. So that was where we started. But after that program got launched and succeeded, we were able to expand into different areas. And so I think we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but that was the first project that the team did. But I guess that's another lesson from L&D, is once you have a successful program up and running, it earns you some credibility to get to play in some new spaces.
That's awesome. And I do want to shift into, I remember in our pre-call, we were talking about this program you started called Mobilize.
Mhm.
So you started on the academy, on the onboarding side. Tell us more about Mobilize. I believe it's still up and running, right?
Yeah. Smiling because that's one of the things I'm most proud of. I think anything that you can start and keeps going when you're no longer there is something to be proud of. So the idea behind Mobilize started with, I guess as I mentioned at the end of the last question, once you have some credibility, you get to ask for new projects. And one of the things I asked to do was to take a look at our engagement scores. So I actually I was within the revenue operations department at Pandora, but we reached out over to the HR team and asked, could we see the engagement scores just for our department and be allowed to analyze them? And through that, I was able to figure out that one of the lowest performing areas was kind of this mixture of things, and you still hear this today at many companies, but things like I want to grow in my career, I want to learn new skills. And I attribute that to two things. I think internally, we're very aware of our desire to kind of move forward in our role and get new responsibilities. But externally, we're also very kind of social creatures, and we want to be able to show our friends and family that we're moving along. We want to show our social network that we've got that new job title. And while I don't think that's always the thing you want to pursue, I understand the human desire to want to grow and move forward. And so the way we responded to this was by building a program that allowed people to advance their skills when they were performing well in their job. We didn't just kind of spin this up out of nowhere. I actually got to do a really fun project where I traveled to all 4 of our main offices and held focus groups. And so rather than just kind of spinning up a solution, I actually talked to people and said, hey, what does it mean to grow in your job? What would it mean to feel like you're advancing in your career? And it was through those focus groups that we were able to figure out that, hey, if we started offering skills training to people who are performing well in their jobs, that's something that would be motivating to them. So we did, it started, I think the other thing I'm really proud of is it was all in-house. Often companies are tempted to go find another, a training company that can come in and offer some great proven programs. And that's always very valuable, but it's also very rewarding for people in my role to get to build something from scratch. So we built programs that we made up off the top of our head, but used all kinds of great research and experience to put together. So we taught things like presentation skills, a slide design class called Decks That Don't Suck, because that's everyone says I suck at PowerPoint. So we built a bunch of programs like that and then got to travel and offer them to people, and immediately saw success within our own department. And today, my friends over at Pandora told me that other departments actually try to jump into that program. Even if they're not in the right department, they can participate, which is pretty cool.
That's awesome. That's awesome. It sounds like you had a great experience at Pandora, and you're so lucky to kind of build that foundation there. And then at that point in your career, you go from Pandora to Blend, right? You come into Blend and you pioneer kind of a new model there of bringing L&D for the first time, and essentially introducing it into the company. So tell us more about what you've been doing at Blend, what you're kind of owning, both from the L&D side and organizational effectiveness side.
Sure. So, as I imagine anyone listening might be curious, like what drew that switch? I think I was ready for a new challenge. I think Pandora, I'd been there for 3.5 years, got to build some great things. And I just knew that if I was going to continue growing, I needed to try it in a new place. And so I joined Blend around 110 employees. And I think on our pre-call, we talked a little bit about how rare that is these days. I think a lot of startup companies would view L&D as something you wouldn't necessarily need until later on in the growth of the company. And I think that sometimes that can be reasonable, but I felt very privileged to have the opportunity to come in at that size. And I was coming fresh out of Pandora, where I'd gotten to see, in my time there, I think they grew from 800 employees to 15 or so hundred. And so you get to see like what's down the line. And I wanted to bring those lessons to Blend and see what I could do to set them up to be successful and potentially avoid any problems I saw at Pandora. So as you mentioned, one of those things that I was really focused on was, actually I kind of repeated a lot of what we did at Pandora. So when I got here, one of the first things we had to establish was an orientation program. So we got that up and running, and that's called Blend University. And it's a program to help people get kind of informed about the company and learn their way around. But after we built that, one of the next things I did was actually engage all of you folks at WorkRamp, because I knew that in order to be successful, I didn't want to become a bottleneck as a trainer. Often, I think what I mean by that is that one of the more traditional models is that there's a training team at a company, usually sitting in HR or people ops, and other teams will reach out to them when they have something they want to teach or share with the rest of the company. That's not always the case. Obviously, they don't always engage those people, but that's kind of a traditional model. And my idea was to try to find something that would allow each department to determine how and when they want to share knowledge that they have on their own time. And so two of the first teams that adopted that very easily and have seen a lot of success with that are our compliance team, our legal and compliance team, and also our information security team. Both of those folks were able to take WorkRamp and turn it into something where whenever they wanted to share a refresher of content or deploy new information to the company, they've been able to do so without even engaging me to create any type of training, which has been great. And they're seeing huge completion rates on those things. And to me, that's the fantasy, because I want to be able to be a consultant and help when they need it. But if it's just something that they want to share briefly and push out to the company, I don't want to slow them down because no one has time for that.
Yeah, you're totally right. We see a lot of clients, and thanks for choosing WorkRamp there. We see a lot of different clients who, one models have a very kind of heavyweight centralized L&D org with instructional designers, and it takes forever to get things through. And then you kind of pioneered this decentralized model where you enable people in every department to essentially run their own L&D org. Would you say, are there any big tips you have for the audience where they kind of want to move more to that decentralized model in terms of how do you make that successful overall?
Yeah, well, let me be the first to say we have not mastered this by any means, because as a company that's growing very rapidly, as mentioned, I joined at 110, we're about 420 now, and that's been over the course of 3 years. And so I think the first thing that comes to mind is that you do want to have the right practices in place. You can have a great tool like WorkRamp, but if you're not communicating well and making sure that people understand how to leverage tools that are available, it's going to make it harder to rely on a model like this, because you really want, the idea here is I think what I want to say is that often a very standard thing that does happen is you'll have an L&D team in HR, and you'll start to see enablement teams pop up, maybe in sales, maybe you'll have like a product ops team, things like that. So this is not about eliminating the need for those teams. I think you still very much need enablement teams tied closely to, specific roles. My job, the way I see my job, is really to establish an ecosystem of, simplicity and transparency, so that people can access the knowledge they need and they can tap into that. So I guess to circle back to your question, my advice really is just making sure you're coordinating with people. I think this is not a set it and forget it type of solution. This is very much something that, like any good practice at a company, needs to be managed over time.
Yeah, that's great too, and I love the model you pioneered. And one of the things when we were talking to recently, and I love this quote. You were saying, I think you were at a conference, and they were talking about how L&D is one of the kind of last non-proprietary functions within a company, but it's moving more to a model that's becoming proprietary and a differentiator for companies. Tell me a little bit more about that mindset. I don't know if you believe it, if you're kind of on board with that. Tell me where you think the market's going from an L&D perspective for all these great companies out there.
Sure. So I do believe it. I definitely subscribe to it. I think I was laughing because it's more, I don't know how true it is. I just think that it's nice to believe. But I can tell you what kind of instincts are kicking in when I think about that. So we know that more and more people are willing to share their approach to things like the sales process, even things like how you structure operations across a company. But often what happens is people start to figure out, some kind of key to success, and then maybe they're less willing to share. And so the quote you're referencing is that at this conference, I had heard someone kind of say on stage that she wished that people in our space were actually more open and sharing, whether that could mean networking, it could mean publishing our work. That's something I want to do more of, is get on Medium and actually talk about what I'm doing. And it's just that idea right there that right now, if I were to share how we're approaching feedback or performance management, no one's going to come to me and say, what are you doing? You're leaking company secrets. But I think if we were to start talking about sales numbers or financial numbers, or even like where the product's going, all those things are often more secretive. And I think that's more what I mean. When I think that that's where things are going, what I'm talking about is that we may see more and more people figure out, if we allow our people to do, this type of work, maybe this is just a random example, but more and more people are starting to experiment with having Fridays off and doing 4-day work weeks. I'm just saying that I believe that we're going to eventually figure out that there's certain recipes that people can rely on that may end up being more proprietary in the future, where companies are going to say, hey, don't tell them how we're handling feedback here because it's such a success. And so I think really it's not actually to point to the fact that it's going to be proprietary in the future, but it's really a call for us to share today, which is why I'm glad we're on this video chat right now.
Well, along those same lines, so looking back at your great career so far, and you have so far to go in the future, if you were to kind of give yourself some tips, if you could pull back time, what are kind of the 1 or 2 tips you would give yourself, and especially this is for those aspiring L&D and talent leaders out there. What tips would you give yourself if you could go back in time?
Yeah, so I'm really just going to go with what's top of mind right now, and so. There's 2 for me. One is people in this function should be aligning themselves pretty closely to the DEI function, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Ultimately, what I'm finding more and more every day is that we're after the same ultimate thing. I think we're just taking different channels and methods to get there. But both functions are really obsessed with making work a more welcoming and functional place for people. And so I think, there's so much opportunity for those 2 groups to overlap and collaborate in ways that I don't think many companies have even tapped into yet. So I'm very curious, and I have a great peer in Ulysses Smith who's in that function right now here at Blend. And so we're constantly in chat trying to figure out what are other ways we could collaborate. But that's one of my pieces of advice is that function and that need is only going to grow. And I think that people in L&D are going to want to take that into consideration and make sure that that's playing a role in the work that they do. And then my second piece of advice is, again, just very top of mind is just never stop talking to people. And what I mean by that is primarily within your organization. I think it can be really easy to set your priorities and start working and just forget to go back and check with people and figure out if what you're working on is still relevant or if they still have the same opinion. I think people's opinions can change sometimes even faster than a product roadmap, and it's worth having those cadenced one-on-ones and making sure you're just eating lunch with different people so that people in this function really need to keep a finger on the pulse of the company. And so that's something I've let slip at times, and I've right now been doing really good at it, and good at it meaning chatting with lots of different people. And I think that I feel much more informed and capable at the company when I am in touch with lots of folks.
And on that second point too, do you have any best practices of, hey, I need to hit 5 to 10 people per month, different levels? Do you have a framework for how you think people should approach that? Because that's a great tip overall that I think everyone, not just in centralized L&D or HR-based L&D, but also on the enablement fronts too, it's very applicable. Any tips around that?
Yeah, I think my first tip actually, so I can reflect back to the beginning of my career because, so one of the things at Pandora that really helped me get my start that I think if hadn't been said to me, I might not be here today. I had a couple people help me get into the company just by sharing, they were already employees and they knew people there and they were willing to kind of share advice. And one of the things they said after they knew I was hired is they said, once you get here, anyone here will take a coffee with you. So you should reach out to them. And so in my first week, I made a list of all these people. And one thing that's always stuck with me is, so one of the first people I reached out to was like a VP of sales. This is when I was a client services coordinator. So just very far removed from this person, but I reached out and said, I'll never forget, this is, his name is Brian Nicholas and he was the VP of sales. And I said, hey, this is me. I want to reach out because I'm trying to learn about the company. And I forget what I said, but you just have to ask. And his response to me was, I wish my own sales team had the courage to reach out to me like this because they could learn so much and I could learn so much. So of course I'd love to get coffee with you. And his enthusiastic response was a real great kind of encouragement for me. And I took that much further and it led me down many successful paths. So I think maybe the first piece of advice is don't ever assume someone's too high. I think too high up in the hierarchy there, because if they're not willing to talk to you, like they better have a pretty good reason for that. I think that that's a general way of thinking. Other than that, no, I don't think it matters that you have to talk to managers or certain levels. I think what's most important is that you diversify who you're talking to. So don't just talk to your friends. Don't just talk to your peers. Don't just talk to people who are willing to reach out to you. You might have to also seek out people who aren't as outspoken, because sometimes people who have different reactions have very different opinions.
And that's awesome. And it gives you really good data points when you're presenting back to leadership. You have all this great insight and input from different parts of the business. So, well, Ryan, I appreciate the time you've taken here today. I love this short chat that we can have.
Yeah.
It's going to be super influential for people out there who are looking at talent and L&D roles. And so, Ryan, thanks for sharing your knowledge and best practices.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Ted. It was a pleasure chatting with you.